Okay, today I have with me Scott Ritter. He's a former UN weapons inspector and Marine, and one of the most sought after individuals for better understanding the Russia Ukraine war, what Ukraine is up against, what Russia is doing. He understands Russia and Russia thinking better than most people. So, Scott, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me. We just picked the perfect time. The garbage man just came out and got my garbage can, so my dogs are barking. So I hope you don't mind that for a minute.
No, I don't even hear it. Well,
Okay.
again, thank you. And at the end of this, we'll tell people about where they can get more information about you and also your book that has come out. But something that I've noticed in my YouTube comments section is a lot of chatter around, I believe it's pronounced Bakhmut. And of course, you know, Ukraine was hit with a barrage of missiles just in the last 24 hours. But maybe you could help my listeners understand from a Ukrainian perspective and also from a Russian perspective, why are people so hyper focused on this Bakhmut battle, and why is it so crucial for the next part of this military operation?
Certainly. Thanks for the question. Look, what's taking place in Ukraine right now? I'm not going to go through the history of how we got there. I'm just going to say this is what's happening. It is positional warfare. The Russians and the Ukrainians have a line of contact that is well defined and has been heavily fortified by both sides. Bakhmut, what was called the Bakhmut Solidar complex, is the Gordian knot of this defensive line. It's that which holds it together. It's heavily defended, heavily fortified, important command and control, important logistics. And if it falls, basically the entire Ukrainian defense will be unraveled. But it's more than that. The Ukrainian government has decided that it's not going to, for instance, withdraw from Bakhmut and build a new defensive line behind it. Actually, some people think that's a better idea. If you look at the map, the territory behind Bakhmut is higher ground, so it's eminently more defensible than sacrificing everything in city fighting. But the Ukrainians made a decision to hold on to this, and they have thrown tens of thousands of troops into this battle. It's become the decisive battle of the war. The number of dead from this battle alone, some people estimate, could be as high as 70,000, and that's over a period of time. But still, that's a heavy number. The Russians have likewise thrown thousands of men into this fight and suffered thousands of casualties. Not on the level of the Ukrainians, but still, it's a very dangerous fight. And the president, you've seen a lot of people try to distance themselves from the inevitability of the fall of Bakhmut. You hear Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, say it's just a place on the map. It is of no strategic value. You've heard General Zaluzhny and other Ukrainian generals saying, "No, I mean we it's a battle, but we've got other things going on, et cetera." Zelensky's probably the only honest one. He said if Bakhmut falls, it opens up the entire Donbass region for Russian occupation. Because here's the deal: there's a finite number of troops. If you spread them out alongst the entire line of contact, same thing with the Russians. And then what's happened with Bakhmut is it's a magnet. So any extra forces you have from the Ukrainians get thrown into Bakhmut. Any reserves thrown into Bakhmut. Same thing with the Russians. The Ukrainians have run out of troops to put into Bakhmut. They don't have anybody left. They're going to any reserves they scramble will be sent to Bakhmut. Russia is still sitting on anywhere from 120 to 200,000 reserves that are still being trained, organized, and they're being prepared to be introduced to the battlefield. So if you have this defensive line and suddenly Bakhmut falls and the front balloons up, you've increased the amount of frontage dramatically. You've gone from here and then it balloons up to here. Russia has troops that can fill this gap, man the lines. Ukraine doesn't. So as it balloons up, Ukraine's going to have to take troops from elsewhere, thin out areas, and try to contain the Russians. But the Russians aren't going to expand in a way that's cannot be contained. And as the Ukrainians withdraw troops from other parts of the battlefield, the Russians will be able to exploit that and push through. So this will be the complete unraveling of the Ukrainian defenses. This is what President Zelensky fears, and this is what I actually agree with him on this point, that there's a real risk that if Bakhmut falls, it will be the unraveling of the Ukrainian defense and the beginning of the end of the Ukrainian army. And this is on top of what General Jan Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, said last month, where he said, I mean, this is an artillery-driven war. I think people need to understand that too. This is a war that's about, the amount of artillery and the intensity of fire, which means artillery ammunition. How many rounds you can fire per tube per day at the enemy dictates the casualties that you produce. This is why the Ukrainians have suffered very heavy casualties. The Ukrainians respond with fewer tubes, but they're quality tubes, Western tubes, 155 millimeter ammunition, and they have better intelligence provided by the United States so they can target it more effectively. And so they're able with less to still blunt and compete with the Russians. But they're firing ammunition at a rate that can't be sustained logistically. And the West has depleted its stocks of 155 millimeter ammunition, and they can't produce it quick enough to meet the expenditure rates of the Ukrainians. And so sometime this summer, Ukraine will run out of ammunition. And if you're in an artillery-driven war, where one side has a tremendous amount of artillery tubes and a lot of artillery ammunition, you have lesser and you run out of ammunition, you're going to lose that war. So this is going to be a double blow. The unraveling of defenses right about the same time that Ukraine runs out of ammunition. And so the potential of Russia to roll up the Ukrainian military increases exponentially. Now, you mentioned the air attack. There's a third aspect to this fight. When the Russians reorganized back at the end of last year, they took a singular commander. At that time was a general named Surovikin, a sort of bald-headed guy they nicknamed Armageddon. He ran the special military operation, but then they brought in General Gerasimov from the general staff to head it, and then there was a ground component commander and an air component commander, and Surovikin was the air component commander. This means that the war is going to get far more complicated. There's bigger frontage, more troops, the need for greater staff capacity, and with a dedicated air commander, it means that the air battle is going to become a separate front. And it's escaped the attention of many people who've been focusing on the more bloody, therefore dramatic fighting in Bakhmut. But what's been happening in the airspace over Ukraine is a very important battle between Ukrainian air defense and Russian long-range strike capacity, the Caliber missiles, air-launched and sea-launched, various air-launched cruise missiles, the Iskander surface-to-surface missile, and a missile called the Kinzhal, which is the dagger or the hypersonic missile that's fired in. The Russians achieved initially, when they started the strategic air campaign, they suppressed Ukraine's infrastructure, especially the power generation infrastructure. And as a result, Ukraine sought enhanced air defense support from NATO, and they've been provided it. Germans provided the Iris-T, the Norwegian United States provided the NASAMS, then we provided the Patriot, other people have provided the Hawk. And the Ukrainians have been trying to build an air defense system capable of withstanding not only the Russian missiles, but new drones, long-range drones, suicide drones, the Iranian drones, the Shahed 136s, the Geranium-2, which is the Russian-made variant of that. And so they've been playing this game where the Russians test the Ukrainians send up their air defense, the Russians identify the air defense, suppress the air defense, and they play this little cat and mouse game. And last night, the Russians sent a marker down that said, "We won. We've now figured out your air defense." And boom, 81 missiles, most of them hit their targets. And 6 of these were Kinzhals, the hypersonics. Up until then, the Kinzhal has been a one-of system. You fire one, you fire another one, because they're very expensive. What the Russians have been doing since mid of last year is they've basically tripled the production capacity for Kinzhals, and those production missiles are starting to reach the front line. 6 were fired last night. That's 6 targets that were guaranteed to be destroyed. There's nothing the Ukrainians can do to stop it. But as the Russians incorporate more and more of these, you're going to see the total unraveling of Ukrainian air defense, which means that the Russians are going to collapse Ukrainian society. And with the collapse of society, the collapse of the economy will come the political collapse of Zelensky. And this is going to happen in parallel with the destruction of the Ukrainian military. And this is why I personally believe this war is probably going to be wrapped up sometime by late summer, early fall. Because the Russians, there's nothing the Ukrainians have that can stand up to what the Russians are getting ready to do.
Yeah. So, you've covered some of this, but I mean, how does this fundamentally shift if all of a sudden all the combined NATO nations can't provide enough artillery rounds to keep up with Russia's 24/7 production? They break through Bakhmut, and then do they just head up to Kiev, or are they? What's the next move? Because if they figured out the air defense system and how to take that out, does that become their next focus, or do they just basically bleed them dry on ammunition?
You know, one of the mistakes that Russia made early on in the conflict was going in with force structure insufficient to the task. They thought they were going to bum rush the Ukrainians. They thought by coming in with 200,000 troops that they could compel the Ukrainians to a negotiating table and get a rapid negotiation into this conflict, and it almost worked. If you remember the three rounds of discussion in Gomel, Belarus, and then the fourth and final one in Istanbul, this was the Russian plan. And it would have worked. Ukraine would have signed an agreement that would have brought an end to the conflict, keeping Crimea permanently Russia. Donbass would be independent, but all other territories would be returned to Ukraine. Zelensky would still govern. The army would still be there, but no NATO presence. That was the agreement. Imagine if they had that agreement today, how many hundreds of thousands of people would be alive. But NATO intervened and said no, nixed it. And so now we're at where we're at. Vladimir Putin on February 21st gave a speech to the Federal Assembly, the Russian Federal Assembly, in which he said exactly what's going to happen. A lot of people listened to it and said, well, why isn't Putin telling us about the big invasion? I said, he did. You just didn't listen to what he said. Putin said number one priority is to restore the economic and social quality of life of Russians. That means Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk. That the Russian military's job is to restore Russian control over the totality of Russia, which means they're going to push Ukrainians out of all the territory that's encompassed there. And then he said, and this is the part that many people missed, that the Russians will continue to push the Ukrainians back to the range of the longest range system provided by NATO, which right now is 150 kilometers because of the HIMARS with the small bomb unit. And now if you look at 150 kilometers from Russia, that includes the city of Odessa, that includes Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov. So Putin has said, we're taking all of these cities. And then the question is, what kind of negotiated settlement do you want? Do you want one where we return these to you? Or do you want one where we keep these? And they're not going to be negotiating with Zelensky. Zelensky is over. This is why you have the air campaign. Russia envisions a political collapse of Ukraine. Russia doesn't need to take Kiev. Russia doesn't want to take Kiev because Russia learned with 200,000 troops, you bit off more than they could chew. That's why the Ukrainians were successful in their counteroffensive in September, because Russia didn't have enough troops to man the line. Russia now has between 600, 700,000 troops, but that's sufficient to do that which Putin just said. Take over the Donbass, recapture territories, push them back. But any concept that Russia is going to go up and occupy Western Ukraine or come down and take Kiev, not with these resources, and Russia's not planning on any mobilization. So Russia's looking for a combined military political solution. The military solution is the destruction of the Ukrainian army, which we see taking place in Bakhmut right now. The political solution is the collapse of the Zelensky government and replacing it with a Ukrainian government that will unconditionally surrender to Russia and then be subjected to basically you'll get a military occupation and a denazification process that's going to take anywhere from 2, 3, 5 years. But that's the future of Ukraine, unfortunately. It's not one that they deserve, but it's the one they're going to get. And they're going to get it because NATO is powerless to stop this. It's not just that NATO doesn't have any artillery ammunition. General Cavoli, the head of the Supreme Allied Commander, the head of American forces, spoke in Sweden in January, and he said the violence, the scope and scale of the violence taking place in Ukraine is beyond the imagination of NATO. That means that NATO isn't trained, equipped, organized, led, sustained to wage that kind of war. So there's nothing NATO can do short of nuclear conflict to stop the Russians from accomplishing what I just laid out. Um, NATO doesn't have an army capable of power projection. You know, everybody said, well, 100,000 American troops. Yeah, that's it. How are they going to survive? Where's their artillery ammunition going to come from? They've given it all to the Ukrainians. The British run out of artillery ammunition 2 to 4 days into a conflict. The rest of NATO does the same. The Germans can't get troops out of the barracks. The French can't get troops out of the barracks. There is no NATO army. There is no NATO capability to wage this kind of war. It will take years to create that kind of capability. Meanwhile, Russia wins the war. So I think, what I laid out for Russia is a realistic projection of what could happen. Nothing is 100% certain. No plan survives initial contact with the enemy, and the enemy always gets a vote. And I'll say this about the Ukrainians. They've shown themselves to be extraordinarily courageous, tenacious, and capable fighters. And so anybody who automatically writes them off is a fool. Whatever Russia victory emerges, it'll only be won through extraordinarily um, high intensity combat that will be costly to all parties involved. But I think that military math is on the side of Russia. It's against Ukraine, and the Ukrainian equation cannot be balanced by NATO, which has nothing left.
Yeah, I mean, from a personal standpoint, I want peace. I've wanted peace. When Boris Johnson went in and said, "Don't do this, NATO will back you," I believe that that was the wrong move. But unfortunately, Ukraine is going to run out of bodies and weapons. And then Zelensky says things like, American boys and girls will fight and die in this war if America doesn't support us. I don't agree with that. But my main thing with like my YouTube channel is I'm not pro Putin and I'm not anti Ukraine. I'm pro peace, but I want the truth because the mainstream media has been misleading people that Ukraine is this like incredible army, which they are. Their bravery is second to none. Their battle up against what they've been up against is incredible. But like you say, mathematically, NATO isn't going to be able to supply bodies, and they're not going to be able to supply weapons enough. So I appreciate you pointing that out. Do you? I hate to like play the blame game, but NATO. Okay, so let me put it this way. Colonel Douglas McGregor told me, that they had this peace deal organized, and now Putin he's not trusting anybody. He's not going to come to the table with the same deal that they have. You just said kind of the same thing. So at what point do you think that they will come to the table? And you said you don't believe Zelensky will be involved.
Zelensky had his